A maid turns into the rude billionaire's new wife. What happens next stuns everyone. As the story progresses, the maid's new life as the billionaire's wife is filled with unexpected challenges and opportunities. She navigates the complex world of high society, where judgment and scrutiny are constant. Amidst the glitz and glamour, she must find her footing and assert her own identity. Viewers will be captivated as they watch her rise to the occasion, proving that true strength and character can shine through even the most trying circumstances.
Constant sound of rain beating against the large windows of the mansion echoed through the silent hallways of Alexander Sterling's estate. The vast Victorian-style house, located on the outskirts of London, was a symbol of the success and power of the millionaire who lived there. Alexander, a 36-year-old man known for his coldness and emotional detachment, had no time for sentimental distractions. He had built his investment empire based on discipline and absolute focus, with no room for sentiment. To many he was admired, to others he was feared. His reputation as a ruthless man, both in business and in his personal life, preceded him. Alexander liked control. Everything in his life was meticulously organized, from his multi-million-dollar investments to the smallest details of his mansion. But this control left him isolated. The walls he had erected to protect his heart also separated him from the world. His life, which was a routine of meetings, business dinners and difficult decisions, was about to change. Isabella Clarke, 25, had just gotten a job as a maid at Alexander's mansion. With a simple background, she had grown up in a small town in the countryside, working from an early age to help her sick mother. She had a delicate appearance, her brown, wavy hair framed a soft face, but what most caught Isabella's attention was her quiet strength. She carried in her eyes a determination that life had taught her early on, not to give up, even when everything seemed to be falling apart. Isabella arrived at the mansion on a rainy day, her heart tight with nervousness. She didn't know much about her new boss, except what the rumors said, a cold, distant man who never got involved with his employees. For her, that didn't matter. All she wanted was to work and provide for her mother. As soon as she entered the mansion for the first time, she was greeted by the housekeeper, the strict and efficient Mrs. Thorne. Isabella followed her instructions to the letter, knowing that any mistake could cost her her job. Over the first few days, she learned the routine of the house, taking care of the cleaning, organization, and making sure everything was spotless. Little did she know that Alexander rarely noticed the details around him. However, in the third week of work, something unexpected happened. Alexander was rarely at home during the day. His office was in central London, and his commitments kept him out for long hours. But that afternoon, an unexpected storm forced him to cancel an important meeting and return home early. As he entered the mansion, he encountered Isabella for the first time. She was kneeling on the floor of the vast hall, cleaning the spotless marble with her gloved hands. Alexander paused for a moment, surprised to see her. She had not noticed him at first, focused on her work. He stood there, watching her for a few moments, noticing the care and dedication with which she worked. But then his usual coldness returned. "Who are you?" His voice cut through the silence, deep and authoritative. Isabella, startled, stood up quickly, almost dropping the cleaning products. Her eyes met Alexander's for the first time. He was even more imposing than she had imagined. Tall, in an impeccable suit, his serious face and piercing eyes made her feel small in front of him. "I am Isabella, sir." "The new maid," she replied, her voice a little shaky, trying not to show her nervousness. Alexander narrowed his eyes, as if he was assessing her. "Make sure you don't get in the way," he said coldly, before turning and heading towards his office, ending the conversation abruptly. Isabella took a deep breath, relieved that the brief encounter was over. However, something in her remained uneasy. There was something in Alexander's eyes, something she couldn't quite place. He was rude, yes, but there was a shadow of loneliness in his gaze that made her wonder what he hid behind that mask of indifference. Over the next few days, Isabella and Alexander continued to bump into each other in the halls of the mansion, always briefly and formally. He was never rude, but the distance between them was evident. He seemed unapproachable, as if he were in an ivory tower from which no one could reach him. Isabella went about her work quietly, but each chance encounter left her intrigued. Little by little, she began to notice small details, the way he rarely smiled, the way his eyes darkened with frustration when he spoke on the phone, or the way he always seemed so alone, even when surrounded by luxury. Behind the coldness, there was something deeper, something that Isabella, unintentionally, began to feel curious about unraveling. To Alexander, on the other hand, Isabella was an enigma. She did her job without complaining, without trying to get close, which he appreciated. But at the same time, something about the way she carried herself intrigued him. There was a stillness about her, a quiet dignity that made him wonder why she seemed different from the others around her. She didn't fawn over him, she didn't fear him, but she didn't try to win him over either. And in the midst of his exhausting, emotionless routine, this small difference began to catch his attention, even if he didn't want to admit it. But for a man who had closed himself off from the world, acknowledging feelings was the first step towards chaos. The days at Alexander Sterling's mansion followed the usual rhythm, but with each day, Isabella felt the weight of her boss's presence more intensely. It was strange how, even with so few words exchanged, he dominated the room. Alexander was like a silent storm, his coldness did not require sharp words, only his presence, which seemed to suffocate any attempt at closeness. Isabella continued her work with dedication, and Alexander treated her the same way he treated everyone around him, with a cutting indifference. To him, Isabella was just another piece in his perfectly controlled life. He had chosen to live this way, without attachments, without affection, because, to him, feelings were weaknesses. And weaknesses were dangerous. They took away focus, and focus was all Alexander had. But little by little, something subtle began to change. It was a cold morning when Isabella, while cleaning Alexander's office, noticed that he had left a book on his desk. It was not the kind of reading she imagined for a man like him. Instead of a financial report or something about investing, it was a classic novel, Wuthering Heights. Isabella hesitated for a moment, her natural curiosity getting the better of her. She opened the book, finding a bookmark on page 87. The passage highlighted a passage that spoke of love, loneliness, and the brutality of emotions. It surprised her. She barely had time to close the book when she heard firm footsteps approaching. Alexander entered the office, his eyes immediately landing on her, and then on the book in her hands. Isabella froze, knowing she might be reprimanded for her curiosity. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice low but clearly uncomfortable. I was cleaning and, the book was open, sir." "I didn't mean to," Isabella stammered, trying to explain herself, as she put the book back in its place. Alexander approached her slowly, carefully picking up the book and closing it. The silence between them was tense. He watched her for a moment, and Isabella felt her heart race. The discomfort was palpable, but there was something else there, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Alexander seemed to let his guard down. Just for a second. "Curiosity can be dangerous, Miss Clark," he said finally, his voice taking on its usual cold tone. Isabella lowered her head, feeling her cheeks burn with embarrassment. "Sorry, sir. It won't happen again." He took a step back, looking satisfied with her answer, but at the same time, something in his eyes didn't match the tone of his voice. It seemed like there was an internal struggle going on, as if he was trying to maintain his usual distance, but somehow he was being pulled out of his comfort zone. "You may leave," he said finally, with a wave of his hand. Isabella left the office in silence, her heart still racing. She knew she hadn't crossed a serious line, but she also knew that something had changed in that brief interaction. The sight of the book, Alexander's expression, and the fact that he seemed less impenetrable than usual. Isabella sensed something different about him. She didn't know if it was just curiosity or if something deeper was brewing, but the way he reacted, even in a cold manner, intrigued her. Alexander, on the other hand, couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that interaction had left. He spent the rest of the day in meetings, trying to ignore what he was feeling. Isabella was no different from other employees he had worked with. But for some reason, ever since she had walked into his home, her presence had been disturbing him. Over the years, Alexander had learned to shut out any kind of emotional involvement. His personal life was an extension of his business, controlled, calculated, and predictable. Emotions disrupted things, and he refused to let anyone into his carefully constructed world. The last time he had allowed anyone to get close, he had been deeply hurt, and he vowed never to make that mistake again. Yet Isabella seemed to get around those defenses without even trying. There was something about her that he couldn't ignore. Maybe it was the way she worked calmly, without trying to impress him. Or maybe it was the quiet strength she carried within her, something that intrigued him and, at the same time, made him uncomfortable. He knew he should keep his distance. He knew letting someone close was dangerous. But the truth was, no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't stop thinking about her. The following week, fate forced them into a new encounter. It was a Friday afternoon, and Alexander had returned home earlier than usual. The heavy rain and chaotic traffic in London had caused him to cancel yet another appointment. As he entered the house, he heard voices coming from the kitchen. Curious, he followed the sound and found Isabella talking to Mrs. Thorne, the housekeeper, as she finished setting the dinner table. It was a common domestic scene, but something about it made Alexander stop and watch for longer than he should have. He had no idea how the simplicity of that interaction affected him. The way Isabella smiled while talking to Mrs. Thorne, the careful way he arranged things, as if every detail was important. It was something that was in complete contrast to the coldness of his own life. And suddenly he felt a strange desire to be part of it, to feel something beyond the constant indifference that enveloped him. Before she could compose herself, Isabella saw him. The smile she had been giving Mrs. Thorne disappeared, replaced by an expression of surprise at seeing him there, watching. Alexander, realizing he had been caught, cleared his throat, as if that could disguise his discomfort. "Mr. Sterling," Isabella said with a slight bow, trying to hide how nervous the moment had made her. "Isabella," he replied, this time calling her by name, something he had never done before. There was a moment of silence between them, and Alexander realized that he was once again on the verge of losing control over his own life. He should back off. He should follow his rule of not getting involved. But for the first time in a long time, Alexander felt vulnerable. And that scared him more than he cared to admit. That afternoon seemed different from all the others in the mansion. The rain, which had previously been beating softly on the windows, now fell heavily, as if reflecting the internal storm that was brewing inside Alexander. The man who had always maintained control, who had never allowed emotions to influence his actions, was beginning to feel the cracks in his armor. In the days that followed their brief encounter in the kitchen, Alexander found himself increasingly disturbed by Isabella's presence. She continued to work with the same dedication, maintaining the professional distance he seemed to prefer. But there was something undeniable in the way they looked at each other now. He noticed the discreet glances she gave him, and although he tried to avoid it, his own eyes seemed to seek her out, wanting to understand what made her different. Isabella felt the change too, but she didn't know how to deal with it. Ever since she started working at the mansion, she had known that Alexander was not an approachable man. He was cold, impassive, and kept a barrier between himself and everyone around him. But little by little, she began to see something else. The way he seemed out of place in his own home, the way he avoided any kind of interaction that wasn't strictly necessary. It was as if Alexander was running away from something inside himself. She wondered what could have happened in his life to make him so distant. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake her curiosity and, even more dangerous, the affection that was beginning to blossom. She knew that getting close to Alexander was risky, but every small gesture, every word exchanged, made her feel a connection that she couldn't deny. A week later, Isabella was in the mansion's garden, pruning some flowers. The rain had stopped, and the afternoon was surprisingly sunny. She liked working there, among the plants, because the garden was one of the few places where she felt completely at ease. Away from Alexander's eyes, she could relax and, for a few moments, forget the tension that hovered between them. But that day would be different. As she cut the flowers, she heard the familiar sound of footsteps behind her. When she turned, her heart raced. It was Alexander, walking slowly toward her, his hands in his coat pockets. He seemed more thoughtful than usual, as if he were carrying a weight he didn't know how to handle. "Isabella," he began, his voice a little softer than usual. "I wanted to talk to you." She looked at him, surprised by his approach. It was rare for Alexander to initiate a conversation that wasn't strictly necessary. Isabella tried to compose herself, wiping her dirt-stained hands on her pants. "Of course, sir. How can I help you?" she asked, trying to keep her tone professional, even though her heart was racing. Alexander was silent for a moment, as if he was choosing his words very carefully. "I've noticed that lately, our relationship has been a little different," he said finally. "And, to be blunt, it bothers me." His words were like a bucket of cold water. Isabella felt a tightness in her chest, fearing what would come next. He had noticed the change, of course, but his tone indicated that this change was not something positive for him. If I did something wrong, sir, I apologize," she said quickly, her heart pounding with nervousness. "I didn't mean to." Alexander stepped forward, his gaze fixed on hers, and Isabella felt the tension between them grow. He shook his head slightly. "No, you didn't do anything wrong, Isabella. I just don't know how to deal with it." He hesitated, visibly uncomfortable talking about his feelings. "I don't know why I'm telling you this, but ever since you arrived, I feel like something has changed. And no matter how much I try to ignore it, I just can't." Alexander's confession caught Isabella completely off guard. She fell silent, trying to process what he had just said. He was struggling with something, and for the first time, he was openly admitting it. "I don't want to complicate things, Isabella," he continued, his eyes intense and filled with internal conflict. "But as much as I try to keep my distance, something about you makes me question all the rules I've set for myself." Isabella felt her face flush and looked down at the floor, unsure of how to respond. Part of her wanted to say that she felt the same way, but another part knew that any involvement with Alexander was dangerous. He was her boss, a powerful man, and the difference between them was colossal. But at the same time, she could no longer deny what was growing inside her. "Alexander," she said, using his first name for the first time, which made him raise his eyebrows in surprise. "I understand that this is complicated. I also feel like something has changed. But you're my boss, and I don't know if we can go down this path." He fell silent, absorbing her words. Isabella was right, of course. The situation between them was complicated, and any involvement could have consequences. But Alexander, for the first time in years, was beginning to feel something that shook him out of his usual coldness. He didn't know how to deal with it, but he knew he didn't want to ignore it. "I know it's complicated," he admitted finally, his voice quieter now. "But I can't pretend nothing's happening." Isabella looked at him, and for a brief moment, she felt the weight of his sincerity. Alexander, the man who had always controlled everything around him, was vulnerable in front of her. He was letting go of his emotional barrier, and it affected her deeply. Maybe we should take a step back," Isabella suggested, trying to be rational, though her heart was beating against it. "Keep things professional." Alexander hesitated. Everything in his mind told him that this was the right thing to do. He should agree, he should keep the distance he had always known how to maintain. But at the same time, he didn't want to. For the first time, he wanted to explore what he felt. "I can try," he said, with a slight smile that surprised Isabella. "But I can't promise it will be easy." Isabella smiled, albeit shyly, and for a moment, the heavy atmosphere between them seemed to dissolve a little. But they both knew that this truce was only temporary. In the days that followed, Alexander really tried to keep his distance, but the emotional impact of that moment in the garden continued to affect him. He knew Isabella was right to want to keep things professional, but every time he saw her, he felt like his decision was being challenged. On the other hand, Isabella tried to carry on with her work normally, but the fact that Alexander had been so sincere left her deeply shaken. Their hearts were in conflict. They knew that any misstep could change their lives, but the attraction between them was something that, no matter how hard they tried, they could no longer ignore. And while they both struggled with their own feelings, fate seemed to be preparing to intervene, bringing to light truths and conflicts that would force Alexander and Isabella to face what they had been trying so hard to avoid. The days dragged on as if time were trapped in some kind of growing tension. Isabella continued with her daily tasks, while Alexander tried to keep his life at its usual pace. But the truth is, nothing felt normal anymore. The distance they both tried to maintain was far from natural, and that was clear to both of them. Every interaction between them was measured, controlled. Isabella avoided getting too close to Alexander, and he, in turn, did his best to appear indifferent. But all it took was a simple glance between them for everything they had discussed in the garden to come flooding back, filling the air with a silent electricity. That week, the mansion received a visit from a guest Isabella had not expected. It was Charles Beaumont, an old friend of Alexander's and a business partner. He was charming, outgoing, and exuded confidence. Charles's presence always shook up the dynamics of the household, but this time, Isabella noticed something was different. Charles seemed particularly interested in her, and it made Alexander visibly uncomfortable. Soon after Charles's arrival, a formal dinner was held at the mansion, a tradition whenever he visited. Isabella was in charge of helping to set the table, ensuring that everything was perfect. However, the atmosphere was charged with a silent tension that only she and Alexander seemed to notice. During dinner, Charles, always sociable, wasted no time in directing his attention to Isabella, who served the dishes discreetly. "Isabella, right?" Charles asked, his blue eyes watching her with a curiosity that made her feel exposed. She nodded politely, trying to maintain a professional demeanor. "Yes, Mr. Beaumont. Can I get you some more wine?" he offered, trying to steer the conversation towards something safer. But Charles didn't give up so easily. "You don't have to call me sir. Charles is fine." He smiled, but there was something in his tone that sounded like a veiled flirtation. "How long have you worked here?" Isabella glanced quickly at Alexander, who was watching the interaction with a hard-to-read expression. The tension between the two men was palpable, though nothing had been said directly. "A few months ago," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. "Can I bring you anything else?" Charles smiled, but before he could say anything else, Alexander intervened. "Isabella is busy, Charles. I'm sure you can help yourself if you need anything." Alexander's voice was sharp, a clear sign that the conversation had come to an end. Isabella, relieved, quickly walked away, but not without noticing the look Charles gave Alexander. There was something unspoken there, a rivalry that seemed old and that was now on the surface. And, for the first time, Isabella realized that she was, somehow, in the middle of this dynamic. When dinner was over, Isabella returned to the kitchen, trying to focus on her tasks, but her heart was still beating fast. She couldn't stop thinking about the way Alexander had reacted. Had he shown jealousy? Was it possible that behind that cold mask was a man struggling with his own feelings? As she was cleaning the utensils, she heard firm footsteps entering the kitchen. When she turned, she saw Alexander standing in the doorway, his eyes fixed on her. The silence between them was heavy, and Isabella felt the air around her grow heavy. "Is everything okay, sir?" she asked, trying to break the tension, but without hiding her surprise at seeing him there. Alexander took a few steps forward, visibly uncomfortable, as if he was fighting something inside himself. "Charles shouldn't have spoken to you like that," he said bluntly, his voice firm. Isabella blinked, surprised by the statement. He was just being polite. She tried to downplay the situation, but Alexander's expression showed he didn't see things the same way. No, he wasn't. Alexander shook his head, visibly irritated. "He always does this. He comes into my house and tries to cross boundaries." Isabella looked at him, trying to understand where all that reaction was coming from. She knew that Charles was a man who liked to joke around with others, but she didn't expect it to affect Alexander in such a way. "Are you jealous?" The question came out before she could stop it. Alexander stared at her for a long moment, his gaze piercing. It was as if he was trying to decide how much to reveal. "I'm not the kind of man who gets jealous, Isabella." His voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was a weight to it that showed how much it affected him. "But with you, it's different." The words hung in the air between them, and Isabella felt her heart race. She knew there was something going on between them, but hearing Alexander admit it, even in an indirect way, left her breathless. "Alexander, that's not," she tried to speak, but he interrupted her, moving even closer. "I've tried, Isabella. I've tried to keep my distance, to keep things professional, like you suggested. But every time I see you, every time Charles or any other man looks at you like that, something inside me," he stopped, taking a deep breath, as if struggling with his own words. "I can't ignore how I feel anymore." Isabella fell silent, her heart pounding so hard she could barely think. The sincerity in Alexander's eyes was overwhelming, and as much as she tried to keep control, she knew her own feelings were on the verge of overflowing. "And what do you want me to do, Alexander?" she asked finally, her voice weak but full of emotion. "What do you expect of me?" He looked at her, his eyes darkened by the intensity of the moment. "I don't know. I just know that I don't want to lose you. I don't want you to go away." His words were a confession Isabella hadn't expected to hear. She knew Alexander's feelings were complicated, but she had no idea how much he was actually struggling with them. "I'm not going anywhere, Alexander." His voice was soft but firm. "But you have to understand that this, between us, it's risky. And I can't let myself fall without knowing if you'll be there to catch me." Alexander took another step forward, his closeness taking her breath away. "I'm willing to try, Isabella. I'm not perfect, but I don't want these feelings to consume me any more than they already have." He paused, his voice softer now. "I want you by my side." Isabella's heart skipped a beat. For so long, she had kept her distance, trying to protect herself, but now, faced with Alexander's vulnerability, she knew she was ready to take that step too. "So, are we in this together?" she asked, her eyes shining with a mixture of fear and hope. Alexander nodded, not looking away. "Together." And, at that moment, under the weight of their confession, Isabella felt that, despite all the complications, she was willing to face whatever came. Because finally, Alexander was ready to open his heart. And so does she. The days following Alexander's confession brought a new atmosphere to the mansion. Even though they both knew what they were about to experience would be complicated, there was a lightness between them that hadn't been there before. Isabella continued to perform her tasks with the same dedication as always, but now, when her and Alexander's eyes met, there was a silent understanding, an unspoken promise that, no matter how difficult it was, they would face everything together. But soon, reality began to seep through the cracks in that promise. Charles was still at the mansion, and his casual insinuations began to bother Alexander more than ever. At one of the dinners, while they were talking about business, Charles made a comment that left the air heavy. "You know, Alexander, a maid like Isabella is a real treasure, right?" said Charles, with a mischievous smile, as he raised his glass of wine. "Intelligent, dedicated, and incredibly beautiful. It's hard to find people like that these days." The comment was made in a light tone, but everyone at the table felt the emotional charge behind it. Isabella, who was serving the meal at the time, almost dropped her plate when she heard Charles's words. Her face flushed, and she avoided looking at Alexander, who remained silent, his expression hardened. But what happened next made it clear that things were changing. "Charles, I think it's best if we focus on business and leave the people who work for me out of it," Alexander said, his voice cold and firm. He kept his eyes fixed on his friend, but the threat in his tone was clear. Charles raised his eyebrows, clearly surprised by the reaction. "Now, I didn't know you were so sensitive about your employees," he said, trying to lighten the mood with a forced laugh. "I'm just kidding, Alexander." But Alexander didn't laugh. He kept his serious gaze on Charles, making it clear that this joke would not be tolerated. Isabella, in turn, felt a mixture of relief and discomfort. Alexander's jealousy was evident, but that only complicated the situation even more. She knew that any deeper involvement between the two could generate gossip, and the last thing she wanted was to be the center of speculation. After dinner, Isabella decided to go out into the garden, trying to find some peace. The sky was overcast, and a cool breeze blew through the trees. She sat on one of the benches, hugging her arms as she thought about what was happening. She knew that Alexander had defended her, but she also knew that soon they would have to face the real challenges that would come with their relationship. She was lost in thought when she heard soft footsteps behind her. She turned to see Alexander approaching. He had changed from his formal suit to a lighter shirt, and his eyes were fixed on her, as if he were trying to decipher what Isabella was feeling. "I needed to apologize for dinner," he said, sitting down next to her on the bench. "Charles crossed the line, and I shouldn't have let that happen." Isabella shook her head, trying not to show how much that had bothered her. "You stood up for him, Alexander. That's what matters," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But this," she paused, trying to find the right words. "This isn't going to be easy, and we know it." Alexander sighed, knowing she was right. He knew that Charles wasn't the only obstacle. The society he lived in, the difference in status, and even the way he was used to living, all of these would be challenged. "I know it won't be easy," he said finally, looking up at the cloudy sky. "But I can't go back, Isabella. Not after everything I feel for you." Isabella felt her heart tighten at the words. Part of her was afraid of what was to come, but another part of her couldn't resist what she felt for Alexander. He was breaking his own rules, and she knew how much that meant to him. "I just don't want you to regret it," she said softly, not looking directly at him. Alexander turned to her, gently holding her hands. "The only thing I would regret is losing you," he replied, his eyes fixed on hers. "I know it's going to be difficult, but I'm willing to face whatever it takes." Isabella smiled slightly, feeling the sincerity in his words. It was hard to ignore how much he was opening up, how much he was willing to change for her. And in that moment, she knew she was willing to take that risk too. "Then let's try," she said finally. "But carefully, for Clara's sake and, for our sake." Alexander nodded, relieved by her decision. He had known the road ahead would be full of challenges, but for the first time in a long time, he was willing to face something with his heart, not his logic. The control he had cherished was slipping away, and somehow that didn't scare him as much as it should have. The next day, Charles left the mansion. Their farewell was brief, and though he maintained his easy smile, Isabella knew he had noticed the tension between her and Alexander. Charles was not a stupid man, and she feared he would take with him more than just fond memories of their stay. With Charles gone, life in the mansion returned to a kind of calm. Isabella and Alexander continued to see each other, exchanging knowing glances and affectionate words in discreet moments. It was as if they were creating a world of their own, a refuge amidst the difficulties they knew they would soon have to face. But what they didn't expect was that the real test would come from where they least expected it. One morning, Isabella received an urgent call from her mother. The woman's voice was shaky, filled with concern. "Isabella, something is wrong with our money. The bank said we don't have enough funds to pay our bills this month. Can you come over here and see what's going on?" Isabella's heart skipped a beat. The salary she earned as a maid was sent regularly to her mother, and it had always been enough to cover their expenses. But suddenly, something was wrong. She knew she had to leave immediately, but she also knew it would test everything she had begun to build with Alexander. If her family were to be involved in any financial trouble, it would mean not only a personal crisis, but also a potential rupture between her and the world to which Alexander belonged. And for the first time, Isabella found herself faced with a difficult choice: take care of her family and face whatever was happening, or keep her relationship with Alexander intact, even though she knew it could ruin everything she was trying to save. Isabella's mother's phone call echoed in her mind as she walked through the halls of the mansion. The chill that ran down her spine came from both fear and uncertainty about what she would find when she returned home. Her thoughts were in turmoil, and the pressure of keeping everything under control seemed to be overwhelming her. Her family had always been her priority, and up until now, her job at the mansion had allowed her to take care of the household bills. But now, something had changed, and Isabella needed to figure out what it was. She knew she needed to tell Alexander about her sudden departure, but the very thought made her uneasy. How would he react? Would he, who was so used to control and stability, understand the urgency of the situation, or would he see her absence as a possible threat to what they were trying to build? Arriving at Alexander's office, she hesitated for a moment before knocking on the door. "Come in," Alexander's firm voice said on the other side. She opened the door to find him sitting at his desk, surrounded by papers and looking as serious as ever. He looked up at her, and his gaze softened slightly. "Isabella," he said, his tone softer than usual. "Is everything okay?" She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Alexander, I got a call from my mother. It seems like something is wrong with my family's finances, and I need to go there to sort it out." The words came out faster than she would have liked, her nervousness evident. Alexander was silent for a moment, which only increased Isabella's anxiety. He slowly stood up, walking towards her. "How long do you need?" he asked, his voice firm but without any judgment. Isabella looked at him, surprised by the question. He didn't seem angry or worried, just serious. "I don't know. It might be quick, but it might also take a few days, depending on what I find." Isabella felt the weight of the words, the fear of losing control over everything that was happening between them. Alexander looked at her, his eyes assessing the situation. "If you need more time, take what you need," he said calmly. "Your family is important, Isabella. I don't want you to feel like you have to choose between them and what we're trying to build." She felt immediate relief upon hearing this. Her heart sank at the idea of leaving the mansion, even for a short time, but knowing that Alexander supported her made the situation a little more bearable. "Thank you, Alexander," she said softly. He nodded, stepping forward, his hands landing gently on her shoulders. "And if you need help, any kind of help, don't hesitate to come to me." His touch, though gentle, held promise. Isabella knew Alexander was not a man to make offers lightly. He was willing to help her, which meant more than he could express with words. "I'll fix it," she said with a tight smile. "I just need to figure out what's going on." Alexander watched Isabella for a moment, noticing the internal struggle she was going through. He knew how important her family was to her, and even though he wanted to keep her by his side, he understood that at this moment, Isabella needed to take care of those who depended on her. "I know it will work," he said with a small smile, before stepping away slightly. "When you get back, I'll be here." Those words echoed within Isabella. She knew the feelings between them were real, but she also knew that in Alexander's world, someone's absence could be interpreted in different ways. She hoped, more than ever, that this temporary separation would not weaken the bond they were creating. Isabella left the next morning, leaving Alexander's mansion with a mixture of anxiety and longing. The journey to her hometown was long, and every mile she traveled seemed to increase the weight of responsibility she carried. When she arrived, she found her mother worried, with papers scattered across the kitchen table. Isabella wasted no time in investigating what was happening with the family's finances. After a few hours of reviewing documents, she discovered what she feared: her mother had been the victim of a fraud scheme. A supposed investment company had promised quick returns, and in a moment of desperation, her mother had entrusted her savings to them. Now, the money was missing, and the accounts were in the red. "Mom, why didn't you tell me about this before?" Isabella asked, her voice thick with frustration and concern. "I didn't want to worry you, darling. I thought I was doing the right thing, that I was investing to secure our future." Her mother's voice trembled, and her eyes full of regret made Isabella's heart squeeze. "We'll figure this out," Isabella said, with a firmness she barely felt inside. "I promise I'll find a solution." But Isabella knew it wouldn't be easy. She already used most of her income to support her household, and now, with the debt caused by the fraud, everything was at risk. She thought about Alexander's words about helping her if necessary, but the idea of involving his world in her personal problems made her uncomfortable. Still, as the days passed and the debts continued to mount, Isabella realized she might not have a choice. She was facing a greater challenge than she expected, and the idea of returning to Alexander's mansion without a solution seemed impossible. Back at the mansion, Alexander spent his days restlessly. Although he was busy with his responsibilities and business, he couldn't stop thinking about Isabella. Her absence, which had previously seemed manageable, now left him with a feeling of emptiness that he couldn't explain. He knew that his life, so controlled and organized, had changed since Isabella had entered it. What he didn't know was how to deal with this change. The man who had always avoided feelings and deep connections now found himself yearning for someone, something he never thought possible. On the third night after Isabella left, Alexander finally made a decision. He knew she wouldn't accept his help easily, but he also knew he couldn't let her face this storm alone. He picked up the phone and made a call. "Lucas, I need a favor," Alexander said, his voice firm. "I want you to find out everything about a fraudulent investment company. I have reason to believe they are involved with Isabella's mother." Lucas, her trusted friend and lawyer, asked her a few quick questions before promising to look into it. Alexander knew that with the right connections, he could find a solution to Isabella's problem, even if she didn't know it yet. As the night wore on, Alexander felt something he hadn't felt in years: anxiety that his help would arrive in time. He knew he was entering dangerous territory, but he didn't care. For Isabella, he was willing to take risks. And deep down, he knew that that decision, more than any other, would change everything between them. The days became an emotional roller coaster for Isabella. Back in her hometown, she was immersed in a sea of paperwork and bills, trying to figure out a way to save her family's financial stability. The revelation that her mother had been the victim of fraud had shaken the foundations of the household. The guilt and regret her mother felt were evident, and this only added to the pressure on Isabella. As she tried to control the situation, thoughts of Alexander kept running through her mind. She missed him more than she cared to admit, but the idea of involving the cold, powerful millionaire in her personal problems seemed too much. Alexander already had enough of his own responsibilities, and Isabella didn't want to be another burden in his life. However, what she didn't know was that Alexander had already gone ahead. Back at the mansion, Alexander spent his days and nights restless. He knew Isabella was strong and determined, but for him, that wasn't enough. He felt an overwhelming need to protect her, to make sure she wasn't swallowed up by a problem she hadn't caused. So he had called Lucas, his lawyer and longtime friend, to investigate the fraud. Alexander was not the kind of man she had expected. He liked to be in control of situations, and the uncertainty of what Isabella was facing made him uneasy. His connections in the business world, the influence he had cultivated over the years, might be the solution to her problem, but he knew Isabella would not accept his help easily. 3 days after the call, Lucas returned with answers. "I investigated the investment firm you mentioned," Lucas began, his voice serious over the phone. "They were already on our radar for being involved in fraud schemes. They scammed dozens of people, promising high returns and disappearing with the money." "And Isabella's mother?" Alexander asked directly. "She was one of the victims. But there is a chance of recovering some of the money," Lucas replied. "I am in contact with the lawyers who are trying to trace the embezzled funds. It will be complicated, but possible." Alexander nodded, his mind already working on the next steps. "Make sure her mother is a priority for getting the money back," he said. "I want everything done quickly." "Of course. I'll do what I can," Lucas confirmed. Alexander hung up the phone, feeling a mixture of relief and worry. He knew he had done the right thing, but he was worried about how Isabella would react. She was proud, and he knew that getting too involved in her problems could drive a wedge between them. But for him, it was a risk he was willing to take. The important thing right now was to make sure Isabella and her family were safe. Days later, Isabella returned to the mansion. The financial problems still hung over her family, but she had done what she could so far. She had found a temporary way to keep the bills under control, but the situation was still far from resolved. The weight of it followed her back, and as she climbed the stairs of the mansion, she didn't know how to explain to Alexander what was happening. She had expected to find the mansion as quiet as she had left it, but upon entering, she was greeted by the housekeeper, Mrs. Thorne, who informed her that Alexander was in his study and wanted to see her as soon as she arrived. Isabella's heart raced. She knew this meeting would be different, fraught with truths she was not yet ready to confront. Entering Alexander's office, she found him standing by the window, his expression serious and thoughtful as ever. He turned slowly when he heard her enter, his eyes softening at the sight of her, but with a tension that suggested he knew more than she had told him. "How was the trip?" Alexander asked in a low voice. Isabella sighed, trying to remain calm. "It's hard. Things at home are complicated," she admitted bluntly. "My mother was the victim of fraud, and now we're struggling to keep up with the bills." Alexander nodded, as if he already knew what she would say. And indeed, he did. He waited a moment before speaking. "Isabella, I need to tell you something," he said, his voice firm but careful. "I know about the fraud." Isabella's eyes widened in surprise. "What do you mean you know?" she asked, her defensive tone immediately emerging. Alexander took a few steps towards her, keeping his gaze fixed on hers. "I asked Lucas to investigate the situation. We discovered that the company that scammed your mother is already under investigation for other frauds. I'm working with lawyers to try to get the money back." Alexander's words were spoken with his typical calm, but Isabella felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. "You did this without telling me?" Isabella's voice was full of surprise, but also indignation. "Alexander, this is none of your business. I should solve this myself." He took a deep breath, knowing his decision would not be well received, but remaining firm. "I know you can handle things on your own, Isabella. But I can't just stand by and watch. You're important to me. I can't pretend your problems don't affect me." The sincerity in his words made Isabella's heart waver. As much as she was furious that Alexander had gotten involved without consulting her, she also couldn't ignore what he was trying to do. He wasn't a man who expressed his feelings easily, and the simple fact that he had taken this step showed how much he cared. "Alexander, this is complicated," she said, trying to find the words. "I can't let you solve my family's problems. I don't want you to think I'm expecting you to." He interrupted her, his voice low and controlled. "I'm not solving this for you, Isabella. I'm solving this because I care about you. Because you're part of my life now, and what happens to you affects me. If it were the other way around, you'd do the same for me, wouldn't you?" Isabella hesitated. She knew he was right. If the situation were reversed, she wouldn't stand idly by either. But it was hard for her to accept that Alexander, with all his wealth and power, was interfering so directly in her personal life. "I just don't want this to change what we have," she said, her voice soft but thick with emotion. "I don't want you to think I depend on you to solve my problems." Alexander took another step towards her, gently holding her face with one hand. "What we have doesn't depend on that. And I'm not here to be the solution to all your problems, Isabella. I just want you to know that when things get tough, I'm here. That's not going to change." Isabella's eyes filled with tears, but she held them back. There was so much she wanted to say, so much she still needed to understand about herself, but at that moment, what Alexander was offering her was exactly what she needed, unconditional support. "I love you, Alexander," she said softly, finally letting the words slip out. Alexander smiled softly, bringing his lips closer to hers. "And I love you, Isabella. I'm not going anywhere." The kiss that followed was full of emotion and promise. Promises that no matter what challenges they faced, they would be together. And for the first time, Isabella knew with certainty that she had found a safe place in Alexander's arms. But as they surrendered themselves to the moment, they both knew the battle was not over yet. The future would bring new obstacles, new challenges, but now they were ready to face them together. The days that followed Isabella's return to Alexander's mansion were marked by an uneasy calm. Although she and Alexander had grown closer, sharing feelings that had previously seemed impossible to express, the shadow of Isabella's family's financial problems and Alexander's involvement in her personal life created an invisible tension between them. Isabella, though deeply touched by Alexander's help, still struggled with the feeling that her independence was at stake. Her love for him grew with each passing day, but along with that love came the fear of losing the essence of who she had always been, an independent woman, capable of solving her own problems. And now, here in the sprawling mansion, with Alexander taking control of her situation, she felt torn. Alexander, in turn, sensed Isabella's conflict. He was a man used to solving problems, making decisions, and making sure everything around him was under control. But for the first time, he felt like he was approaching a limit, a fine line between helping someone he loved and suffocating her with his domineering ways. He loved her deeply, but at the same time, he didn't know how to handle that love without seeming like he was invading her space. However, before they could deal with this internal conflict, the world around them began to press in. One afternoon, as Isabella was walking through the gardens of the mansion, lost in her thoughts, she was interrupted by an unexpected call. The number on her cell phone screen was unknown, but when she answered, her voice trembled when she heard who was on the other end. "Mrs. Clark?" The man's voice was calm but formal. "My name is John Reynolds. I'm a journalist for the Financial Observer. I'm investigating a story about the recent investment fraud that has affected several families, and I understand that you are involved. I'd like to discuss the story with you and better understand how it has affected your family, and, of course, your relationship with Alexander Sterling." Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. What had once seemed like a contained problem was now beginning to expand into something bigger and more dangerous. She knew that if her relationship with Alexander were to come to light in the wrong way, it could cause a wave of gossip and speculation, not only about her life, but also about Alexander's reputation. "I have nothing to say about it," she replied, her voice firm but her heart pounding. "And my personal life is none of your business." "I understand, Mrs. Clark, but people will talk anyway. It is better that your story is heard in the right way, don't you think?" The journalist insisted, in a persuasive tone. "I would like to avoid misunderstandings and give you a chance to clarify your position." Isabella hung up the phone, feeling panic take over. She knew that what was about to happen could complicate everything between her and Alexander, even more so if the press started to explore her involvement in the fraud and, worse, the relationship between her and her boss. Without a second thought, she ran to the mansion, quickly climbing the stairs to Alexander's office. When she entered, he was on the phone, but upon seeing her expression, he immediately hung up, his concern evident. "What happened?" he asked, standing up. Isabella felt the words catch in her throat, but finally said, "A journalist called me. They know about the fraud. They know I'm involved, and what's more, they know about us." Alexander frowned, but his expression showed no surprise. He had faced the media before, but he knew that this kind of attention could destroy not only Isabella's privacy, but also compromise his business image. And he would not allow that to happen. "I'll handle it," Alexander said, his voice firm and controlled. But Isabella shook her head, her heart racing. "It's not that simple, Alexander. They won't stop until they have a story. And if that story gets out the wrong way, they'll twist it all around. They'll say that I'm with you because of the money, that you solved my problems because I'm your maid. That'll destroy us." The truth in Isabella's words hit him like a blow. He knew that the media would not hesitate to exploit their relationship in a sensational way. What's more, he knew that if he wasn't careful, Isabella could be seen as someone who used her closeness to him to take advantage of the situation. "You're not going to face this alone," he said, moving closer to her. "We're going to deal with this together. And let's be honest, so there's no room for distortion." "But what if this destroys your reputation?" Isabella asked, feeling tears threaten to fall. "I don't want to be the cause of a scandal. I don't want people to think I'm taking advantage of you." Alexander held her hands, his eyes fixed on hers, filled with a calm that only he seemed capable of maintaining. "Isabella, I don't care what the media says. I don't care what the world thinks. What matters is what we have. And no one, not journalists, not gossip, can take that away from us." Isabella took a deep breath, trying to absorb the strength Alexander was giving her. She knew he was right. No matter how much the world around them tried to pressure them, what they had was real. She just had to believe in it enough to weather the storm. The next day, Alexander and Isabella, in a difficult decision, agreed to give a brief interview to the journalist who had contacted her. The idea was clear: they would control the narrative. They wouldn't let gossip destroy them. And most importantly, they would not allow Isabella's mother's deception and story to be twisted to appear as if she took advantage of Alexander's help. They met with the journalist in a discreet cafe, away from prying eyes. Alexander, always calm and controlled, explained Isabella's financial situation and how the fraud had affected her family. He made sure to emphasize that the relationship between him and Isabella was something that had arisen naturally, even before the financial problems came to light. Isabella, in turn, spoke about her own life, her struggle to support her family and how her work at Alexander's mansion was important to her, not just for financial reasons, but because she had found someone there with whom she shared a true connection. The journalist seemed surprised by the honesty and simplicity of the story. He had expected a scandal, something that would make for splashy headlines. Instead, he found two people fighting to protect the most precious thing they had, their love. When the interview ended, Isabella and Alexander walked out together, hand in hand, facing the world with their heads held high. They knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would still be challenges ahead, but they were ready to face them together. As they walked outside the cafe, Isabella turned to Alexander and, with a smile that lit up her eyes, said, "I think we can handle anything now." Alexander smiled back, squeezing her hand tighter. Together, always. And in that moment, they knew that despite all the obstacles, the love they had built was strong enough to weather any storm the world threw at them.
If you're excited about this story, please let us know. If you enjoyed the video, please press 1. If not, press 0. Your feedback has inspired me to collect more uplifting and meaningful stories.